Hello everyone, it's Dr. Rafael Gutierrez. Welcome again to the channel. And today I am going to just mention a little bit about what I've done with Yorick. What I did is, if you notice the ribs, I've made them blue here, and that's because you have cartilage there. And I've already shown you how I drew some of the sutures on the skull. And there are some things that I actually do want to tell you about before I talk about the vertebrae and the ribs more than I did last time. One is, if you actually remember, I actually talked about doing a cut over the head here, like a crown, going all the way across, and it separates things from the front from the back. So in the front, you'd have anterior, back would be posterior. And these terms are relative. So for instance, if you look at my nose, it would be anterior to the bones around the jaw here, the maxilla. But if you actually go deeper, the maxilla would be anterior to, let's say, the ear. And so, depending on what you're looking at, it may be anterior compared to something else, posterior to something else. And so that's one of the things I wanted to tell you about is you have the coronal cut, frontal cut, and you have anterior and posterior. I also mentioned the sagittal suture here. And the sagittal suture is actually technically a mid-sagittal plane, which separates the right from the left. Now, when you do have a mid-sagittal plane, anything that's closer to the midline would be medial. Anything going away from it would be lateral. And again, these are relative terms. So if something is, for instance, in your sternum, it would be medial, your ribs would be lateral to it, but your humerus would be lateral to the ribs. And so it all depends on what you're actually looking at. These terms are actually going to be very important when we talk about other bones. The other term that I actually want to talk about is if you were to take your work and go straight across here. That's actually a transverse cut. And transverse cuts things from superior above and inferior below. These are words that are going to help you understand a lot of the different issues that you will, different things that you will actually look at and help you understand the names. Now, what I did is I made two lumbar vertebrae. Now, you have five lumbar vertebrae. They're actually the ones down here. And you will notice that in York, they actually did a really good job at making sure you can see that they're a lot thicker than the ones higher up. The reason is lower down, you're holding more weight. And so I did this with Play-Doh, you can see. And right away, you can see certain things. I'm going to turn it this way so you can see it a little better. Then you have this thing here called the spine. And if I turn this over here, and this one should be over back here, you actually have two projections here which are called the superior articulate facets. Underneath, you'll have inferior articulate facets. And what happens is when you put them together, you end up having the superior articulate facets interact with the inferior articulate facets, and you would have a disc between these. If you remember, I mentioned the intervertebral disc. The intervertebral disc pretty much is the intervertebral disc is where the two vertebrae come together. Inner usually means between. And so if you actually look at this, when I put these together, and I guess this one looks better, you can see it better this way. What you'll notice is you form a little hole between them right there. You can see it right here. And that hole is called your intervertebral foramen. And you have other things that are involved here. So the big round thing I made here, which you can make it by just making a ball of Play-Doh, is called your body. The two little things here that are where the body comes with these little projections on the side are called your pedicles. Ped means feet. So if you actually think of this as a little man with the head here, arms, the feet would be here. The hole in the middle would be the vertebral foramen. And I already talked about the superior and inferior articulate facets. These are just areas where things are going to come together. Spine, and this area here, where you can see between the process moving to the sides here, is called the lamella. Now, these processes going to the side are called your transverse processes. And the reason I actually talk about the lumbar before the others is because the lumbar tend to be simpler and easier to see than the other things. Now, just as you have a lumbar, if you take your lumbar, and as I made two, I actually can modify it and make one slightly different than the other. One of the things I'm going to do is I'm going to take the spine, make it come out a bit more, pointing down here. The other thing I'm going to do is I'm going to add a little pinch to my lumbar vertebrae up here, another pinch for a lumbar vertebrae here, and these are actually a bit exaggerated, and a pinch underneath here, and another pinch here. The reason I'm making these, you can see the pinch, what I'm talking about, I pinched up here and down here, and you also have a little pinch on the transverse process here. Now, once you actually do that with your lumbar vertebrae, it's no longer a lumbar vertebrae. It has different areas that are important. It has everything the same except for these three areas, which are called transverse. Well, this one's called the transverse costal facet. Costal means rib. And anytime you hear facet, it's usually an area where a bone's going to come in there. This one would be the superior costal facet. The one down here would be inferior. Superior because it's above, inferior below. Now what happens when you have a rib? Your rib has actually a head, a neck, and a lump of bone called a tuberosity, or tubercle. And the rib would actually come like my finger, touch the superior costal facet and the transverse costal facet like this. You can see it there. But on an opposite one, you'll actually touch, the head will actually touch the inferior costal facet like this. And so you end up having three spots where the rib is going to come into the vertebrae. And now you actually have your vertebral vertebrae, your thoracic vertebrae. And you can modify it even more. For instance, if we take our thoracic vertebrae and we play with the spine a little, we can give it a little spike. And we can also make this a little flatter here. You still have the superior articulate facets, but what you can also have is a hole. I'm just pinching so I can make it different. And you would have a foramen on the transverse process, which would be your transverse foramen. And you would do that on both sides. And now you have a basic cervical vertebrae. You can see the hole here and here, which are the transverse foramen. And now if you notice, if you start with a lumbar vertebrae, you can actually modify it to make it into a cervical. Now there are a couple atypical cervical vertebrae. Pretty much a second cervical vertebrae is called the axis. And what it has is, it has an extra projection called the dens. The transverse processes are really brought in a bit. You still have the transverse foramens, and you just have a big bony projection called the dens. On top of that, you have the atlas. And atlas is holding up your head. What you would end up having is you lose the body, but you have a place for the dens to go in. And I'm not going to do that, mainly because this is more for a basic understanding of anatomy. And so you can see how that works. Now that we do that, we can actually look at the ribs. And if you look here, you can see that the ribs go into the vertebrae. So while you have a head, a neck, and a tubercle, this end is also called the vertebral end. And if we come around here, we can see that the ribs take this cartilage, which I now made blue, and touch the sternum. And so that area is called the sternal end of the ribs. You do also notice that there's a place where you have a big bend here, which is called your costal angle, or angle of the rib, depending on who you have. And those are actually areas that do form, so you can actually feel them on yourself. The sternum I've already talked about, and next time I will talk about the clavicle, which I haven't talked about. It's this one here. And actually may as well just do it now. So the clavicle is here. You'll notice that this side here comes into the manubrium, which is part of the sternum. This one over here goes to the scapula. And so you have the sternal end and the clavicular end. And when you're taking anatomy, you will be able to see that bone a bit more. You can notice that you have a notch in your neck right here. And on either side, you have the sternal end of the clavicle. Interesting thing about the clavicle, clinic-wise, is that it is made through intramembranous ossification, just like all the rest of the bones that I've talked about so far. Most of the long bones are made in a different way, which I will talk about and show you with clay models, but The neat thing about them is that they are made through intramembranous, and they are complete, relatively complete. They are going to grow in different areas. So during birth, sometimes the uterus contracts at the time when the clavicle is right there, and it will compress it, causing it to break. Now, in this clavicle, the clavicle is relatively straight. It tends to be more of an S shape. You can feel it on yourself. And so that's actually where you have the fracture point of the clavicle. Next time, I will actually talk more about the scapula, and you'll notice why I want you to know the medial, lateral, superior aspects when I talk about it. I hope you enjoy this. Have a nice day. If you did, please share, like. If you're trying to learn anatomy, I do recommend this model, and I will, for home studies, I will put a link to it. Play-Doh, I can put a link on that if you want. You can actually sometimes get it at local stores at a really good price. And if you want to help support, I actually do have some books on sale. I will put the links for those as well. Hope you enjoy this and have a nice day.